It's noon, and the rain has been falling for 3 days straight. Not a drizzle. A wall of water so thick you can barely see the tree line 20 feet away. You're sitting at the back of a shallow cave, knees pulled to your chest, watching the one thing keeping you alive. A small cluster of glowing coals, no bigger than your two fists pressed together. And they're fading. You have no lighter, no matches, no backup plan hiding in a waterproof bag. You have what's in front of you, and what's in front of you is losing the fight. The rain is blowing in sideways now, and every gust carries a fine mist that lands on those coals and makes them hiss. That sound, that quiet little hiss, is the most terrifying sound in the world right now. Because you know what comes after the hissing stops. This is the problem that haunted our species for hundreds of thousands of years. Not finding fire, not even making fire, keeping it alive. Through the rain, through the storms, through weeks of wet season that turned the entire world into a soaking cold, hostile place where a naked flame had no business surviving at all. And yet our ancestors did it, generation after generation, across every wet continent on Earth. They kept fire alive through conditions that would kill it in minutes, using nothing but observation, ingenuity, and the kind of desperate creativity that only comes from knowing the alternative is death. Here's what makes this story genuinely strange. Archaeologists discovered that certain ancient human populations, real groups of people living under some of the most brutal monsoon rainfall on the planet, survived for thousands of years without ever developing the ability to create fire from scratch. Not once. They had no fire-making technology, no bow drill, no flint striking, nothing. And yet they always had fire. Through every storm season, every gray, endless soaking month, fire was always there. How? That question is going to pull you through this entire video because the answer reveals something remarkable about how our ancestors thought, what they understood about the natural world, and just how sophisticated Stone Age survival actually was. By the end, you'll look at a simple campfire completely differently. Let's start at the very beginning of the problem. The rain doesn't kill a fire all at once. That's the first thing to understand. It dismantles it. Systematically, methodically, like a slow siege. The first thing it takes is your fuel supply. Wood lying on the ground starts absorbing moisture within hours of rain beginning. After 3 days of continuous downpour, a log on the forest floor isn't just wet on the surface, it's saturated. Pick it up and you can feel the weight of all that water inside it. Try to burn that log and it doesn't catch. It steams. It pulls heat out of your fire instead of adding to it. Your flames shrink trying to drive the moisture out. And if the wood is wet enough, they shrink until there's nothing left. The second thing rain takes is your oxygen. This one surprises people. Heavy rain drives air pressure changes, but more immediately, falling water physically disrupts the airflow around a fire. A flame needs a constant supply of fresh oxygen moving upward through the burning material. Rain hammering down around a fire breaks up that flow. It's like trying to breathe while someone keeps splashing water in your face. The fire gasps. And the third thing rain takes is your heat. A fire maintains itself by generating more heat than it loses. That's the whole game. Rain tips the balance. Every drop that lands near the coals carries away thermal energy. Every gust of wet wind strips warmth from the burning material. The fire spends more and more of its energy just staying warm enough to keep burning, and eventually, it can't keep up. The math turns against it, and when the math turns, the fire dies. Now here's the thing about ancient humans facing this problem. They couldn't just shrug and say they'd start another one tomorrow. Fire making from scratch, the kind you see demonstrated in survival videos, is genuinely one of the hardest physical skills a human being can master. Bow drill firemaking requires perfectly matched, perfectly dry wood. The drill has to be exactly the right hardness relative to the hearthboard. The notch has to be precisely carved. The tinder bundle has to be bone dry and perfectly prepared. Expert survivalists who practice this skill regularly still fail in anything less than ideal conditions. Now take away the dry wood, take away the dry tinder, soak everything within a mile radius for 3 weeks straight. Make the air itself so heavy with humidity that even wood stored under shelter slowly drinks the dampness out of the atmosphere. That's monsoon season. That's the wet season in Central Africa. That's winter on the coast of prehistoric Europe. In those conditions, making fire from nothing wasn't difficult. It was essentially impossible, which means that if your fire went out, it might stay out for weeks. And weeks without fire, in the cold, in the dark, with predators working the edges of your camp, was a death sentence. So, ancient humans didn't think about fire the way we do. We think of fire as something you create when you need it. They thought of fire as something you inherit and protect, something alive, in a very real sense, something that had to be fed, sheltered, and kept breathing just like any other living member of the group. And the person responsible for that, the firekeeper, held one of the most critical roles in the entire community. The first and most fundamental technique they developed looks, at first glance, like giving up. When a serious storm was coming, the firekeeper didn't try to keep big flames roaring. Big flames are actually the most vulnerable thing in a rainstorm. They're tall, exposed, hungry for oxygen, and every raindrop that hits an open flame steals heat directly from the combustion zone. A proud, roaring fire can be beaten down to nothing in under 10 minutes by a determined downpour. So the keeper did the counterintuitive thing. They let the flames die. On purpose. They coaxed the fire down to its absolute core, a tight bed of dense, glowing red coals, and then they buried it, covered it completely with a thick layer of dry ash. To anyone watching, it looked like the fire was dead. It wasn't. It was hiding. Ash is one of the most underrated materials in the ancient world. It's a remarkable insulator, trapping heat the way a thick blanket traps body warmth. But ash also has a property that made it specifically perfect for rain survival. It's water-resistant. Not waterproof, but resistant. Rain hitting a thick bed of ash doesn't immediately reach the coals underneath. The ash absorbs the water, forms a crust on top, and the coals below stay dry. Meanwhile, the reduced oxygen under the ash layer forces the coals to stop burning fast and start smoldering slowly, consuming fuel at a fraction of the normal rate. The fire drops into a kind of suspended state, sleeping but alive. Survival instructors call this banking a fire. Done correctly, banked coals can survive 12 hours or more, long enough to outlast most storm nights. When morning came, the keeper would carefully brush away the wet ash crust, expose the glowing coals underneath, add carefully prepared dry tinder, and blow gently. The flame would rise from what looked like cold ash and dead ground. The fire had survived the night without anyone seeing it, without anyone knowing it was there, hidden from the rain by a layer of its own remains. Archaeologists have found evidence of this practice at sites spanning hundreds of thousands of years. At Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, fire use traces back roughly 1,000,000 years. At Kesem Cave in Israel, a single central hearth was used repeatedly for tens of thousands of years, leaving layer upon layer of ash like geological strata. Each layer represents a fire that survived, a storm that lost, a keeper who knew exactly what they were doing. But banking only solves part of the problem. It keeps fire alive through a stationary night. What happens when you have to move? When the water is rising and your camp is becoming a river? When the hunting grounds have shifted and the group has to travel through days of continuous rain? You can't carry a banked hearth with you. You need something smaller, something that can survive being carried through a downpour pressed against a human body. In 1991, a body emerged from melting alpine ice in the mountains between Austria and Italy. Hikers found it and assumed it was a recent accident victim. It wasn't. The man had been frozen for over 5,000 years. Scientists named him Otzi, and he became one of the most analyzed humans in history. Among his equipment, researchers found a small container made of birch bark. Inside it, pieces of charcoal wrapped carefully in fresh maple leaves. It took researchers a while to understand what they were looking at. Then it clicked. Otzi wasn't carrying charcoal as a material or a pigment. He was carrying a living ember. The maple leaves throttled the airflow, slowing the smoldering to almost nothing, making the coal last for hours. The birch bark container shielded it from the rain and snow of the alpine crossing. He was carrying fire across a mountain range in winter. A single coal, kept alive through careful management, ready to be blown back into a flame the moment he stopped and needed heat. This wasn't unique to Otzi. Evidence of ember-carrying containers appears across multiple ancient cultures on multiple continents. The technology is elegant in its simplicity. You reduce fire to its smallest possible unit, a single coal, wrap it in materials that limit oxygen without completely cutting it off, seal it against water, and carry it against your body where your own warmth helps keep it alive. One person, one coal, the entire group's fire future pressed against their chest. And the people who carried those embers had a secret weapon that modern people have almost entirely forgotten. Growing on the sides of dead birch trees across Europe and Asia, there's a fungus shaped roughly like a horse's hoof, Fomes fomentarius. Ancient humans knew it as tinder fungus. and it behaves unlike almost any other natural material on Earth. Prepare the spongy inner layer correctly, and you get something that catches even the faintest spark and then holds it, not as a flame, as a slow, creeping smolder that moves through the material hour after hour, consuming almost nothing, producing almost no visible light, but maintaining genuine heat the entire time. The critical property is its resistance to humidity. Damp air that would suffocate a normal ember barely affects prepared tinder fungus. Rain-heavy air that makes conventional fire starting nearly impossible slows it down, but doesn't stop it. An ember carried in tinder fungus could survive an entire day of travel through wet season rain. Otzi was carrying tinder fungus too. So were people at sites across Europe going back tens of thousands of years. Clearly processed, clearly prepared with intention and knowledge. This was a technology, a specific, studied, deliberately developed technology for beating the rain at its own game. Ancient humans had examined their forests closely enough to identify one specific mushroom growing on one specific type of dead tree that, when processed in one specific way, would hold fire alive through a monsoon. That's not folk knowledge. That's material science. That's the same kind of systematic observation and testing that we now do in laboratories, conducted over generations by people who understood that the cost of getting it wrong was everything. And those island and coastal tribes who never developed fire-making at all, this is how they survived. They inherited fire from a time before anyone alive could remember, passed it forward through every generation using techniques exactly like these: banking, carrying, protecting, never once letting it go out, because they had no way to bring it back. The fire they tended was in a very real sense ancient, older than anyone could count, a living thread connecting them backward through time to ancestors they had never met. Back in your cave, the rain is still falling, but you've done what needed doing. The coals are banked under a mound of ash, the wet crust forming on top while the heat holds steady underneath. Tomorrow, when the storm breaks even slightly, you'll need fuel. And here's the last piece of the puzzle. Because finding dry wood in a world where everything is wet requires you to stop looking where your instincts say to look. Groundwood is useless. It's been lying in standing water for days. Pick it up and you're picking up a soaking sponge that will drain heat from your fire faster than it adds any. Ancient humans knew that dry wood doesn't lie on the ground during rain season. It stands, dead branches still attached to trees, lifted above the flooded earth, drained by gravity, sheltered from direct rainfall by the living canopy above. Snap one and the inside is frequently dry, even when the bark is dripping. And even wood that has been rained on is often only wet on the outside. Split a saturated log open and the core is pale and dry, protected by its own wet outer shell. Then there was the material firekeepers valued above almost anything else during wet season: resin wood. Certain trees, when damaged, flood the injury with sticky resin that saturates the surrounding wood. That wood becomes essentially pre-soaked in fuel. It lights even when damp, it burns hot, it doesn't care about the rain. Birch bark, loaded with natural oils, peels off a living tree in the middle of a downpour, and still catches flame. These materials weren't just useful, they were the difference between a fire that survived the wet season and one that didn't. The firekeeper's wet season system was a continuous loop: collect standing dead wood between downpours, split logs to the dry core, gather resin wood and bark whenever found, stack tomorrow's fuel in a ring around tonight's fire, using the existing heat to dry out wood the rain had already claimed. So the fire was constantly reclaiming wet material and converting it to usable fuel. The fire fighting back against the rain, not just surviving it, but actively working against it. This is what ancient firekeeping actually was. Not a single trick, not one clever technique, a complete integrated system of knowledge built over hundreds of thousands of years of wet seasons and cold nights and desperate high-stakes experimentation. Banking, ember carrying, tinder fungus, standing deadwood, resin fuel, drainage and shelter engineering. Every piece developed because someone, somewhere, in some storm, lost their fire and had to figure out how to make sure it never happened again. The rain outside your cave is finally softening, just slightly. The hissing from the ash mound has stopped. Underneath it, invisible and silent, something is still glowing, still alive, still waiting. Your ancestors kept that flame going through a million years of storms. Tonight, so did you.